Hi, my name's Ethan, and I used to believe that love, real love, was stronger than doubt, until my father called me into his office and said, "If I'm wrong about your wife, I'll give you 2 beachfront homes and my entire company." That's when I knew something was already broken. So I planted a recording device on the woman I'd shared my life with for over a decade. And what I heard, what she said when she thought I wasn't listening, it didn't just break my heart. It rewired the way I understand betrayal. They didn't scream. They didn't curse. They planned. And I was the plan. Now I'm standing here, not just as a man who was betrayed, but as the final product of a test I never agreed to take. And maybe the worst part? They still think they won, but they have no idea what I've done or what's coming next. Family dinners at my father's house were never casual. They looked polite on the surface, almost elegant, but everyone around the table understood the rules. You sat where you were told, you spoke when invited, and you never mistook comfort for belonging. That evening, the private dining room was lit softly, the kind of lighting meant to calm nerves. A long wooden table stretched between us, polished so carefully it reflected the chandelier above. Beyond the glass doors, the ocean moved quietly in the dark, distant and irrelevant. My father sat at the head of the table, his back straight, his hands resting calmly as if the room itself answered to him. I was the youngest son. Still was, no matter how many years passed, no matter that I had my own marriage, my own career, my own life. In this house, age did not mature you. Obedience did. My wife sat beside me, posture perfect, a polite smile fixed on her face. She knew how these dinners worked. Everyone did. My father didn't raise his voice. He never had to. Control came naturally to him, like breathing. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down and folded his hands. "I want to make something clear tonight," he said evenly. "This isn't about money. It's about trust." No one interrupted. No one ever did. "If I'm wrong about your wife," he continued, looking directly at me, "I'll give the 2 of you 2 beachfront mansions and my entire company. $89 million. Clean transfer. No conditions." The words landed heavily, not because of the number, but because of the assumption behind them. He called it a test. It sounded generous, almost noble, but something in my chest tightened. Offers from my father were never gifts. They were transactions dressed as concern. I waited for him to ask how I felt. He didn't. My wife's reaction was subtle, a measured inhale, a brief smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She nodded once, carefully, as if acknowledging a business proposal rather than a statement about our marriage. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. This conversation wasn't meant to include me. I was the subject, not the participant. "This is about protecting my family," my father said, his tone calm, reasonable. "You'll understand that one day." I already did. He reached to his side and slid a thin folder across the table. It stopped just short of my plate. "The test is simple," he said. "Time always reveals truth." I placed my fingers on the edge of the folder but didn't open it. The paper felt heavier than it should have. The word test echoed in my mind, not for the first time. Growing up, everything had been a test. My patience, my loyalty, my silence. Being measured was familiar. Being trusted was not. "No rush," my father added. "Take your time. Maturity is knowing when to listen." The message was clear. Refusing would mark me as ungrateful. Questioning him would make me appear weak. Everyone around the table waited. The room held its breath. I nodded. "All right," I said. My voice was steady. "We'll do it." Outwardly, I complied. Inside, something shifted. I felt the old instinct rise, the one that kept peace by absorbing pressure. Freeze first, agree second. Survive quietly. But this time, I noticed it happening. Dinner ended not long after. Polite goodbyes. Controlled smiles. As we walked out, the folder remained unopened in my hand. My father didn't look back. He never needed to. The drive home was quiet. Streetlights passed rhythmically, each one giving me too much time to think. I replayed the evening in my mind. Not my father's words, but my wife's tone. One line she'd said earlier, almost casually, suddenly felt misaligned. It wasn't guilt I felt. It was doubt. And doubt, once planted, doesn't stay small. If this was a test, I needed to understand something first. Who it was really for. That night, I didn't open the folder, but I made a different decision I couldn't undo. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the neighborhood was quiet. Just porch lights glowing and the soft hum of sprinklers kicking on across the lawns. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and something baked earlier in the day. Probably the banana bread she liked to make when she was anxious. She went straight to the kitchen without saying much, humming lightly, like nothing had happened. I dropped my keys on the counter, loosened my tie, and sat at the edge of the couch in the living room. The house was clean, cozy even, but it didn't feel warm. Not tonight. The folder from dinner was still in my briefcase, untouched. I could feel its edges through the leather, like it was pressing back. She moved through the house, like it was just another Tuesday night. Dishes were rinsed. Lights were turned off in rooms we weren't using. Her rhythm never broke. Mine did. I watched her disappear down the hall without looking back. We didn't argue. We didn't need to. The silence between us was thick and practiced, like two people who'd both agreed, long ago, that some truths weren't worth the noise. But tonight, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like surrender. I stayed up. She went to bed. I sat there thinking about all the times I'd kept my mouth shut. As a kid, I learned early. Speaking up got you labeled difficult. Disagreeing got you punished. Even now, my father's version of love came with terms. I'd spent a lifetime learning to keep the temperature down, but the cost had crept in slowly. You silence yourself long enough, and you forget the sound of your own instincts. I ran a hand through my hair, leaned forward, elbows on my knees. Trust, I thought, should feel steady. Not like this. It wasn't fear that held me back. It was the possibility of being right. Around 1 a.m., I heard her voice, not close. She was in the guest room. That alone was strange. The door was slightly cracked, and she was speaking low into her phone. I didn't move, just listened. Nothing she said was alarming. Not really. But her tone. It wasn't the one she used with me. Softer, warmer, familiar in a way that made me feel suddenly removed from my own life, like I was eavesdropping on someone else's home. She laughed at something. Then her voice dropped even lower. I stepped back before she saw me, then walked to our bedroom, closed the door quietly behind me. I didn't accuse. I didn't even ask. But something clicked into place. Not proof, just a pattern. I knew the difference between imagination and recognition. This wasn't a movie running wild in my head. This was memory sharpening itself in real time. Lying in bed, I thought about my options. I could confront her, but that would only trigger defenses. I could pretend it was nothing. That's what I was raised to do. But I wasn't a boy anymore, and I was tired of being measured in someone else's terms. I needed to know the truth, not for my father, not for revenge. For me, it wasn't about catching anyone. It was about not betraying myself again. The next day, I worked from home. She left early, same as always, routine unchanged. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out, said she had back-to-back meetings, smiled like everything was fine. By noon, I was at the electronics store. "Something small," I told the guy behind the counter. Discreet. He didn't ask questions, just pointed me toward what I needed. Back home, I sat with the device in my hand for longer than I'd expected. It was lightweight, quiet, easy. But I wasn't. I hesitated. Not because I doubted her, but because I knew what crossing this line meant. There wouldn't be a rewind. I thought about every time I'd told myself, maybe I'm just being sensitive. Every moment I'd swallowed discomfort for the sake of peace. I was done guessing. I activated the recorder. My hands weren't shaking. I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I placed it inside her purse, buried under receipts and lipstick and loyalty cards from places we didn't go together anymore. I told myself it was temporary, just long enough to put my doubts to rest. I had no idea what I was about to hear. The first day passed like wet sand slipping through fingers, slow, heavy, quiet. I worked from home again, though I don't remember doing much beyond clicking around and glancing at the recording app on my phone. Just in case, nothing yet. No late-night whispers, no pet names, no trace of secrets. But still, I checked, every hour, sometimes twice in 10 minutes. Not because I thought I'd catch something, because waiting, for me, had never really been about outcomes. It was a reflex. Like holding your breath before entering a room you already know is cold. I've spent most of my life waiting for things to turn, for voices to shift, for the tension to start, for silence to stretch too long or end too abruptly. It didn't begin with my wife. It started much earlier, back when my feet barely touched the floor at the family table. That memory crept in while I was sipping coffee on the back porch, watching the light move through the trees. I must have been 10, maybe 11. Dad had called a family discussion, which always meant a monologue with built-in consequences. My older sibling spoke first, clear, confident, practiced in how to say the right kind of truth. When I opened my mouth, I remember him holding up his hand. "Be patient," he said, almost gently. "Your time will come." It didn't. Not that day. Not the one after. Instead, I learned how to be still. How to nod when I didn't agree. How to speak last, and rarely. In that house, being included was always conditional. And those conditions, they weren't written anywhere. You felt them in who got asked questions, in who got invited to fishing trips, or game nights, or business talks over whiskey. The cost of inclusion was silence, and silence was safety. Back in the present, I sat at my desk, same chair I'd used for years, the leather worn just enough to fit the curve of my back. I tried to focus on invoices, but the numbers blurred. My father's voice echoed in my head. "This is for your own good." He'd said that so many times it stopped sounding like language and more like law. I realized then the test wasn't new. It wasn't some clever trick to catch my wife or save me from heartbreak. It was the same script, just on a larger stage. Same lines, same silence, same rules. I leaned back, let my eyes close. Another memory returned. This one sharper. I must have been 15. He'd promised something, can't remember what, maybe a trip, maybe a chance to shadow him at work. I spoke up, questioned a decision he'd made about one of my brothers. I thought I was being brave, honest. I wasn't yelled at. That would have been easier. Instead, I was left out. For weeks, no one told me when the family met for brunch. I wasn't looped into conversations. My name didn't come up unless someone needed something. There was no drama, just absence. That's when I learned that speaking up didn't start fights in our family. It made you invisible. So I stopped. I grew into a man who knew how to make things easy. At work, in friendships, even in marriage. I smiled through awkwardness. I reasoned through disrespect. I told myself it was maturity. But now, listening for evidence in my own house, I saw it for what it was. Adaptation. I wasn't afraid of being wrong about her. I was afraid that being right would confirm something deeper, that I'd always chosen comfort over clarity. That evening, she got home around 6. We made dinner together. She laughed at something on her phone and showed it to me. I smiled, played along. But somewhere in the rhythm of chopping onions and washing pans, a quiet shift happened in my mind. I stopped asking, "What if I'm imagining this?" and started asking, "Why does this feel so familiar?" Patterns don't just show up. They repeat because they've worked, because they've gone unchallenged. That's when I knew I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Confrontation only works when both people are trying to meet in truth. I'd spent a lifetime watching what happens when someone breaks the unspoken contract. My father never argued. He erased. I couldn't afford that again. So I waited. Not from fear, but from calculation. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. And silence, I realized, could be my first weapon. I thought I was waiting for proof. What I didn't know was that the proof was already speaking. It had been 3 days since I slipped the recording device onto her phone. I wasn't proud of it, still not. But I'd stopped apologizing to myself for it. Some things go beyond what's comfortable. Some things demand certainty, not trust. We were out running errands, nothing major. She needed to pick up a refill at the pharmacy, and I'd offered to drive. That offer, of course, wasn't innocent. I wanted proximity. The kind of closeness that didn't raise questions. The kind that let me sit quietly in the car while she went inside. And hit play. My phone was already in my hand. I opened the app out of habit more than anything. I wasn't expecting much. Up until that point, the recordings had felt like dead air. Background noise. Routine conversations. A few harmless calls to her sister. But I checked anyway. Thumb tapped the latest file. I didn't even put it to my ear. Just let the audio run through the car speakers. At first, just ambient sound. A car door, shoes on pavement, automatic doors sliding open. Then her voice. "Yeah, he doesn't know," she said, light, almost amused. I froze. The car suddenly felt too small. Another voice followed, male, casual, confident. "You think he's catching on?" A pause. Then her, "No, not yet. He's still chasing the wrong thing." The steering wheel under my palms went cold. I didn't move, didn't blink. The voice coming through the speakers was unmistakably hers, but different, calmer, sharper, like she wasn't performing anymore. I turned the volume up, careful not to draw attention in the lot. From where I sat, I could see her through the pharmacy windows. She was smiling at the cashier, paying for something in a paper bag. Meanwhile, back in my car, the world was tilting. The man chuckled. What happens if he figures it out? She answered too fast. He won't. That's the point. I didn't feel anger yet. That would come later. What I felt in that moment was a kind of stillness I hadn't known since I was a kid. Sitting quietly in the hallway, listening through the walls when my parents thought I was asleep. Back then, staying quiet was the only power I had. And somehow, that reflex had followed me here, to a Target parking lot, with sweat trickling down my spine as I listened to my wife collaborate. You know his dad's not just testing him, she added. He's watching how I handle it too. This is all theater for him. You're handling it perfectly, the man said. I muted the audio, not because I couldn't take more, but because I'd heard enough to understand. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was orchestration. She knew. She was part of it. And worse, she wasn't doing this under duress. She was performing, participating. She was in it, willingly, strategically. It felt like biting down on glass. My body registered the pain before my brain did. I looked at my hands, white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my breath thin and shallow, caught behind clenched teeth. I didn't storm inside. I didn't demand answers. Instead, I turned off the ignition, waited until I saw her exit the building, and smiled when she slid into the passenger seat. You okay? She asked, her tone syrupy, easy. Yeah, just tired, I said, voice steady. Dinner that night was ordinary. She talked about weekend plans, something about a dinner with her friends. I nodded at the right times, asked about the menu, complimented her choice of wine. Inside, my mind was already sorting the timeline. Later that night, once she was in bed, I went to my office. I closed the door and reopened the app. I played the recording again, this time with headphones, this time with a legal pad next to me. I jotted down timestamps, labeled voices, took notes like it was a deposition. I needed this documented. Not for revenge. Not yet. I needed it because gaslighting comes easy in families like mine. If I didn't write it down, I knew someone, maybe even me, would try to convince me it didn't happen that way. This was real, and I would not be the one caught off guard again. There was a moment around midnight when I thought about waking her up, confronting her, laying it all out. But I didn't, because I knew that game. My family taught it to me. Confrontation leads to denial. Denial leads to questions about your sanity, your tone, your timing. The whole thing becomes about your reaction, not the act itself. I wasn't giving her that out. Not yet. Instead, I picked up a second notebook. This one wasn't for timestamps. It was for connections, people, motives, potential pressure points. Not paranoia. Preparation. Twist S7 didn't arrive with drama. It showed up with quiet intention. I would gather everything. I would not flinch. And when the moment came, I would be 10 steps ahead of every lie she, or my father, could offer. I didn't press play again that night. I didn't need to. Not yet. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. The goal wasn't to catch them in the act. It was to let them keep talking until they wrote the confession themselves. I hadn't heard the worst part yet. And for the first time, I knew exactly who this test was designed to break. And for the first time, I knew exactly who this test was designed to break. I sat in my home office long after the house had gone still. The light under my door was the only one left on. Upstairs, I could hear the faint creak of the bed as she shifted in her sleep, unaware of the distance growing beneath the same roof. The recording was paused on my screen. I didn't touch it right away. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't rush you. It waits. It convinces you that stopping now might be a form of mercy, that living with part of the truth is better than destroying the rest of your life with the whole thing. I'd lived that way before. Half answers, soft explanations, stories that almost made sense if you didn't ask too many questions. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The hum of the air vent filled the room. My hands rested flat on the desk, steady. I had learned how to live with half answers. They never saved me. I reached forward and pressed play. At first, it was just the sound of movement, a door closing, footsteps. Then her voice again, clearer this time, closer to the microphone. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't cautious. She was comfortable. "I told you," she said. "He won't push back. He never does." The man laughed softly. "You're sure?" "Positive," she replied. "He hates conflict. Always has. That's why this works." My eyes dropped to the desk. I focused on a small scratch near the edge, as if anchoring myself to something solid. She continued, explaining it like a plan she'd rehearsed. "Let my father handle the pressure. Let him frame it as concern. Let me stay quiet and cooperative." The outcome, she said, was already moving in the right direction. She talked about money like it was inevitable, about timelines, about how long I'd need to process before making the expected choice. Then she said my name, not with affection, with certainty. "He'll do what he always does," she said. "He'll keep the peace." That was the moment everything dropped away. No confusion, no second guessing, no room left for benefit of the doubt. This wasn't fear talking. This wasn't a mistake made in stress or loneliness. This was calculation. This was someone counting on my history to secure her future. I felt my ears ring, not loudly, just enough to blur the edges of sound. My body didn't react the way people expect. No shaking, no tears. I didn't slam my fist on the desk. I went very still. It was the same stillness from childhood, the one that used to show up when I realized the adults in the room had already decided my role. Back then, freezing was how I survived. Now it felt different. This wasn't just betrayal. It was exploitation. A system built around my predictability. I paused the recording and sat there for a long time, breathing slowly, letting the information settle into place. Anger would have been easier. Anger burns out fast. What I felt instead was clarity. I considered waking her up, asking her to explain, watching her face shift as she searched for the right version of the truth. But I knew better. Confrontation would hand her control. She'd cry, deflect, reframe. And once the conversation happened, the evidence would disappear. So would my leverage. I opened a folder on my computer and saved the audio file. Then I saved it again, in 2 other places. An external drive, a secure cloud account she didn't know existed. I labeled everything carefully. Dates, times, notes. Silence, I realized, could do more damage than any accusation if you used it deliberately. I shut down the computer, turned off the light, and stood there in the dark for a moment. Upstairs, she slept peacefully. The house looked the same as it always had. Nothing had changed, except everything. I didn't confront her. I didn't tell my father. I did something far more dangerous. I started preparing. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music swelling in the background, no thunder rumbling in the distance, Just the quiet click of a saved file, the hum of my office lamp, and the sound of my own breath as I sat there, still but not frozen. When morning came, the house looked the same, smelled the same. My wife moved through the kitchen like any other Tuesday, hair pulled back, sipping her usual tea, humming something off-key under her breath. She smiled when she saw me walk in, as if nothing in the world had changed, but it had. I stood there in the doorway, watching her move between the toaster and the sink. The woman I had built my life around looked exactly like the woman in the recording. That was the hardest part. She wasn't a stranger. She was consistent. It wasn't about looking for signs anymore. I wasn't hoping to catch something. The performance wasn't for me anymore. I just needed to keep pace until the curtain dropped. I mumbled something about heading into the office early and left before she could kiss me goodbye. The drive downtown was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just replayed her voice in my head, sharp, rehearsed, certain. She had spoken like someone who had studied the rules. I realized then I had never asked what game we were playing. Back in my office, I pulled out the file drawer marked Personal, a folder I hadn't opened in years. Deeds, contracts, joint accounts, trust structures my father had once insisted on for legacy purposes. Legacy. A word that sounds generous until you realize it only ever flows one way. At the time, I'd signed things without thinking too hard. The family lawyer had walked me through documents quickly, reassured me they were standard language. Most of it had sounded like background noise, legalese, and placeholder phrases. But now I read every word, and something started to stand out. The word temporary, temporary trusteeship, temporary allocation rights, temporary authority granted in absence of dispute. It was all there, buried under a mountain of civility. I began highlighting lines, making notes in the margins. There were decisions made on behalf of me, papers signed by others with implied consent. My signature was there, just not always where it mattered most. The test wasn't just emotional, it was logistical, structural. It was built into the bones of the house I lived in, the company I worked for, and the marriage I had spent years maintaining. And I had walked into it willingly, trusting that loyalty came with reciprocity. That afternoon, I made a call to someone I'd worked with years ago, a real estate attorney who had helped me close a few deals before my father's people took everything in-house. I asked him to meet for coffee, nothing official, just a hypothetical. We sat in the corner of a small cafe near the courthouse. He listened while I laid out my questions like a man preparing for a chess match, never mentioning names, never showing the board. I asked about clauses buried in partnership agreements, about trustee roles, about asset protection in family-led companies. He leaned back in his chair after a while, narrowed his eyes, and said, "You're not the one being tested, are you? You're the one they don't expect to win." That stayed with me the rest of the day. He didn't know the details, but he knew the tone. He'd seen it before. People pushed into corners, told the rules after the game had already started. His advice was simple: understand the pattern, then change the rhythm. That night, back at home, I poured a drink I didn't touch. My wife was upstairs, probably reading or pretending to. I spread the paperwork out across the table, side by side, highlighted, annotated, and then I started drafting a document of my own. It wasn't flashy, no accusations, no direct references, just a small, controlled amendment, limiting access to a shared financial account. Something she wouldn't notice immediately, But when she did, it would force a conversation she hadn't prepared for. It wasn't revenge, it was position, a counterweight. I printed the form, placed it in an envelope, and scheduled a courier pickup for morning delivery to my bank. Small, silent, irreversible. As I turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway of my office, I looked back at the desk one more time. I thought the hardest part was hearing the truth. I was wrong. The hardest part was knowing what would happen when they realized I'd stopped playing along. They say silence is power, that if you hold your tongue long enough, the world will eventually show its hand. But that only works until your silence becomes their problem. A week had passed since I made the first move. Small, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely. But someone had been looking, and they didn't like what they saw. It started with an email from my father's assistant. Simple, courteous. Mr. Lancaster would like to meet with you Thursday morning. Family office, 9:30 sharp. Your wife will be joining. That last line hung heavy in my chest. By Thursday, I'd prepared myself for every possibility except one: how familiar the walk from the elevator to the glass conference room would feel. Like stepping back into a cage you'd convinced yourself was never locked. The room had changed, not in decor, but in atmosphere. Usually, meetings like these were casual. Loose folders, Dad's half-drunk coffee, maybe a sports game murmuring from the muted television in the corner. But today, everything was placed with surgical precision. Legal pads at every seat. Bottled water lined up like chess pieces. A junior associate from the firm sat to the left, her presence unacknowledged but intentional. I took my seat without a word. Dad greeted me with a thin smile. Thanks for making time. My wife sat across from me, her posture perfect, her eyes unreadable. She didn't reach for my hand. I didn't expect her to. The conversation began harmlessly. Questions about schedules, vague talk about the upcoming fiscal quarter, but then, the pivot. So, my father said, leaning back, I noticed you made a few adjustments to one of the joint accounts last week. His tone was pleasant, curious almost, but his eyes weren't asking, they were measuring. Routine, I said, keeping my voice steady. Just consolidating some responsibilities. It was overdue. A pause. My wife nodded as if in agreement. Of course, we all want things to stay clean. She used that word deliberately. Clean. As if I'd dirtied something. The associate scribbled a note. That's when I realized this wasn't about concern. This was performance. Rehearsed lines. Calculated glances. The kind of confrontation where no one ever raises their voice, but every word cuts a little deeper. Have you been sleeping well? My father asked, feigning casual interest. You look tired. I'm fine. We just noticed you've been a little distant, my wife added. Not yourself. There it was. Not a confrontation, an evaluation. The kind where they pretend to worry while planting seeds of instability, stress, mental strain. Is he all right? Whispered just loudly enough to become a rumor. I kept my hands folded, eyes steady. I've been focused, nothing more. Dad smiled again. Focus is good, as long as it doesn't become obsession. You know, we've all seen how high-pressure situations can distort judgment. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I offered the kind of smile that says, I know exactly what you're doing, and it's not working. They kept circling, trying to get me to react, to defend myself, to raise my voice, to give them ammunition. I gave them none. The meeting wrapped on a note of forced agreement. "We just wanted to realign," Dad said. "Keep communication open. We're all on the same side," my wife chimed in. As I stood to leave, she gently touched my arm, her grip firm, not affectionate. In the hallway, as we walked toward the elevator, she leaned in just enough that only I could hear. "You should be careful," she whispered. "Your silence doesn't protect you anymore." I turned to look at her. She held my gaze without flinching. There was no warmth there, no guilt, just calculation and something else. Warning. In the parking garage, I sat behind the wheel of my car for a long time before starting it. Not because I was shaken, but because I finally understood. They weren't reacting to my move. They were punishing it. Silence had worked for years, as long as it served them. The moment it shifted in my favor, it became dangerous. And that's when I knew. They thought pressure would make me retreat. What they didn't realize was that pressure had finally made my decision clear, and once the decision was made, there was nothing left to wrestle with. The storm inside me, the swirl of betrayal, disbelief, and hesitation, quieted. I didn't feel calm exactly. I felt settled, like a heavy object had finally dropped into place inside my chest. That morning started like any other. I brewed my coffee in silence, the familiar hum of the machine filling the kitchen. Upstairs, the usual footsteps, drawers opening and closing. The sound of her voice speaking softly on the phone drifted down. Her routine remained intact, perfect, practiced, but I didn't look for meaning in it anymore. By 7:45, I was in my car, the signed document in a leather folder on the seat beside me. One page, clean language, no room for interpretation. What it said, in essence, was simple. The authority they thought they held no longer existed. 2 weeks ago, I might have stared at it endlessly, imagining the fallout, questioning if I'd lost something I could never get back. But now it was just a fact. Something real in a world that had been paper thin. I pulled into the parking garage of my attorney's office just after 8:10. Early, but not rushed. I nodded to the receptionist, bypassed the waiting room, and stepped into the small private conference room where Charles, my attorney for over 15 years, was already seated. He stood when I entered. No small talk this time. "You're sure?" he asked after reading it again. "There's no walking this back." "I don't want to walk it back." He studied me for a moment, as if searching for some sign of emotional hesitation. I gave him none. "I've reviewed every line. You understand this cuts out any future attempt to reposition assets, reassign shares, or re-enter you into the trust management structure." "I understand." He passed me a pen. "Then we sign. You date." The scratch of ink against paper didn't echo, but it might as well have. That single movement closed every door they'd hoped to keep ajar. "This is going to cause a ripple," he said, sliding the final copy into a sealed envelope. "You've just stepped out of the frame they built for you." "Good," I replied. "I was never supposed to be in it." I left his office without looking back, driving home with the kind of alertness I usually reserved for icy roads. Not out of fear, but readiness. I knew what tonight would be. By 6 o'clock, we were seated around the same dining room table where this all began. The table where dinners had turned into subtle interrogations, where glances carried more weight than words. Tonight, it held more than plates and silverware. It held intentions. My father sat at the head, a crisp folder beside him. The folder. The one with the so-called test. He always brought it like it meant something, like it held power. I let him go first. We wanted to revisit where things stand, he began. There's been some movement, changes that weren't communicated. I didn't reply. He looked at my wife, who gave the briefest nod. She kept her hands folded. Her eyes found mine once, steady, as if to say, "We warned you." "I assume you've come with something to clarify your position?" my father asked. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the sealed envelope, and set it beside his folder. He hesitated before picking it up. When he did, he opened it slowly, like something might leap out. His eyes scanned the lines. Then again. Still, no one spoke. I leaned forward just enough to be heard. "I'm not taking any test anymore. No justification, no explanation, just the truth." Silence expanded like a drop of ink in water. It spread across the room, into every corner, until even the sound of the wall clock ticking became intrusive. My father looked up. His face didn't register anger. It registered loss. My wife blinked once, a long blink, the kind you do when you're recalculating. Her jaw set, but she didn't speak either. That was the moment everything turned. Quietly. Completely. The document in his hands was more than paper. It was a boundary drawn in ink, a refusal to be pulled any further into their choreography of manipulation. He closed the folder, slowly, deliberately, then pushed it slightly away from him, as if it had lost all meaning. My wife stood first. No dramatic exit. Just stood, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked out of the room. My father remained seated for a while longer. Then he looked at me, not as a son, not as a threat, but as someone who had just done something irreversible. "You do realize," he said, "that there's no reversing this?" "I do." He gave a faint smile, though there was no amusement in it. "You always were quieter than I expected. And you always mistook that for compliance." He exhaled through his nose, stood slowly, and walked past me toward the hallway. I remained in the chair long after they left. The silence now wasn't heavy. It was still, like the kind of hush that comes right before sunrise. I should have felt victorious, should have felt some release, some wave of relief. But I didn't. Walking away should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something I didn't yet have a name for. That sensation lingered for days. It trailed me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't pack much, just what fit into a single suitcase and a box of files. 2 days after the final confrontation, I rented a modest place near the coast. A quiet one-bedroom with creaky floors, neutral walls, and windows that overlooked nothing in particular. But they let in the morning light, and that was enough. Weeks passed. Not one of them reached out. Not my father, not my wife, not even my siblings. At first, I kept waiting for the blowback, for someone to corner me, ask what the hell I thought I was doing. But nothing came. Just the hollow silence that settles in when people stop seeing you as useful. And maybe that was the clearest signal of all. Life now moves slower. The phone doesn't ring as much. No meetings. No inbox packed with fires to put out. It's quieter, externally at least. Internally, things are still rearranging themselves. I wake up without an alarm. I walk to the cafe on the corner most mornings, order the same coffee, nod politely at the staff. I answer a few calls from clients who still want me. Not the version of me who showed up at boardrooms, but the version who listens more than he talks. At first, the calm unnerved me. I didn't know what to do with it. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with applause. It just settles in like fog, soft, slow, and barely noticeable until you realize everything feels different. At times, it even felt like loss. Then I realized it was. The legal pieces eventually found their final shapes. There were no lawsuits, no screaming matches in public, just a few quiet shifts in paperwork. I relinquished my seat on the family board. They closed my access to certain funds. I returned a few keys. A name was removed from a few documents. Mine. They thought I'd fight for it, that I'd panic. But you don't panic when something dies. You mourn it. And then you bury it. My wife and I haven't spoken since that night. The papers haven't been filed yet. But the substance of our marriage dissolved long before any attorney would touch it. There's no yelling now. No ultimatums. Just absence. And I don't hate her. That's the part people don't understand. I used to think betrayal had to come with screaming or breaking things. But sometimes, betrayal is just someone staying quiet long enough for you to hand them everything and watching them not even flinch when you lose it all. What ended us wasn't just the lie. It was the strategy. You can forgive someone who panics. You can't come back from someone calculating your reactions like clockwork. She didn't destroy me, but she did make me realize how long I'd been erasing parts of myself just to keep the peace. It took time to unlearn that. Some days, I walk the coastal path near my place, early, before the sun's too high. There's this one stretch, about halfway in, where the trail curves, and you get a full view of the water. No houses, no traffic, just waves moving in and out like breathing. That's usually where I stop. I don't bring my phone. Or if I do, I switch it off. I used to think silence was dangerous, that it meant disconnection. But I was wrong. Silence isn't the threat. Silence is the space where your own voice comes back to you. For the longest time, I thought I was holding on to her voice, my wife's, I mean, that something in it grounded me. But the truth is, what I missed all this time wasn't her voice at all. It was mine. And I have it again. I don't need to shout to prove I survived. I don't need to win the argument anymore. There's nothing to win. Just space to live. Space I finally made for myself. I was always the youngest, the one who didn't cause trouble, the one who smiled through meetings, nodded when expected. My role was clear. Be steady. Be quiet. Be easy to manage. I played it well, but not anymore. I've learned that boundaries don't end things. They begin them. For the first time, I get to decide what my name means, who I show up for, what I build next. And maybe that's not flashy. Maybe it's not dramatic, but it's mine. That walk along the water, the one I take most mornings. Today it felt different. Not lighter, just clearer. There's something honest about the ocean. It doesn't pretend. It just moves. Always forward. Never apologizing for the shorelines it's reshaped. I guess I'm trying to do the same. I wasn't wrong about my wife. And my father wasn't wrong about his test. We were all wrong about what power was supposed to buy.